On Mardi Gras night, 1860, the wealthiest city in the American South burned bright enough to be seen from the river. Gas chandeliers in the St. Louis Hotel lit a ballroom of 3,000. Sugar fortunes wore diamonds traded at the slave pens 4 blocks away. The opera was sold out for the 74th night running. Beneath the floor, the river was already eating the foundations. Beneath the floor, the bet was already going bad. And 145 years later, on a Monday morning in August, the water this city had stolen its life from would come back for everything it built. Chapter 1. The Bet That Should Have Failed. The man who chose this ground had been told it would flood, and he chose it anyway because the river left him no other answer. His name was Jean-Baptiste Lemoine, Sieur de Bienville. He was 37 years old in the spring of 1718. The youngest of 11 Lemoine brothers, several of whom had already died, searching for a way to anchor French power on the mouth of the Mississippi. Bienville had been looking for that anchor for nearly half his life. He had paddled the bayous, surveyed the islands, climbed up the banks of the great river to the bend the local Houma and Choctaw peoples called the place of the high ground. He stood there and saw what nobody else seemed to see clearly. The Mississippi River drained nearly half of the continent above him. Every furred pelt, every barrel of grain, every bale of cotton that would ever be raised in the heart of North America would have to float past this single curve of the river before it could reach the sea. Whoever owned this bend would own the wealth of a continent. And so, Bienville, against the protest of his own engineers, planted his flag in a strip of soft delta mud no higher than a man's chest at flood stage. He called the settlement after the regent of France, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. The grand title was a kind of bribe. The land was barely land at all. His engineers were not wrong. The settlement flooded in 1719. It flooded again in 1720. A hurricane in 1722 tore down most of the houses Bienville had managed to put up. Yellow fever moved through the colony every summer, then cholera, then smallpox. Of the first 1,000 colonists shipped out from France, more than half were dead within 5 years. The Crown sent more. The Crown sent indentured Germans, condemned criminals, women rounded up from Paris orphanages and convents, all of them dispatched to a swamp that could not feed them. Half of those died as well. But the river held. Every spring it carried down from the Ohio Valley and the Missouri and the great forests further north the cargoes Bienville had imagined. Furs first, then tobacco, then indigo and rice from the surrounding plantations as enslaved Africans began arriving by the boatload from the 1720s. By 1743, when Bienville was finally recalled to France in failing health, the city still consisted of fewer than 2,000 people in a few damp streets. It looked like a failure. He died in Paris in 1767 without ever returning, and he never saw the city he had founded amount to anything more than a fever swamp. Yet the bet he had made was already silently paying off. The geography was working, the river kept coming, and somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic, the cotton gin and the steamboat and the demand of a hungry industrial Europe were waiting to be invented, all of them about to multiply Bienville's wager beyond anything he could have imagined. The Spanish took the colony from France in 1763. They built it back from the great fires of 1788 and 1794, fires that destroyed 856 houses in 2 nights. They rebuilt in brick and stucco with tile roofs and interior courtyards. They wrote the building code that gave the French Quarter its actual French Quarter face, which is, in truth, a Spanish colonial face wearing a French name. The colony came back to France for 20 days in 1803, and then was sold to the United States for $15 million, the largest peaceful land transfer in human history, working out to less than 3 cents an acre for the entire western half of what would become the country. The Americans did not understand what they had bought. Thomas Jefferson had asked for the city alone. Napoleon, desperate for cash, threw in the entire watershed. By accident, by panic, by the math of a French war chest running on fumes, the United States acquired the river that Bienville had planted his flag beside. The bet, 85 years after it began, was about to begin paying its real dividend. By 1810, 10,000 people lived in New Orleans. By 1840, more than 100,000. The city had passed Baltimore and Boston and was the 3rd largest in the country. Every flatboat full of corn from Indiana, every barge of pork from Cincinnati, every bale of cotton from Tennessee and Mississippi and Arkansas had to come past the bend of the river where a stubborn French naval officer had once said, "Here, this is where it goes." The land flooded, the fever returned every summer, but the money came too, and the money came in a flood the river could not match. Chapter 2. The Three Crops That Built the Crown. By 1860, three commodities moved through this single port in numbers no other American city could match, and one of them was human. The first was cotton. In the years just before the Civil War, more than 2 million bales of cotton passed through the wharves of New Orleans every season, each bale weighing roughly 500 pounds, the total value exceeding $180 million in 19th century money. Translated into the purchasing power of today, that is something close to $6.5 billion passing through a single port in a single year. Cotton came down the river from plantations as far north as Tennessee and as far west as Arkansas, packed onto flatboats and steamboats, marked with the seal of whichever cotton factor in New Orleans had financed its growth. The factors were the men at the heart of the wealth. They lent money to planters against next year's harvest. They stored, graded, insured, and resold the cotton. They charged a commission of 2.5% on every transaction. A successful cotton factor in the 1850s might earn between $50,000 and $120,000 a year, at a time when a skilled tradesman in the city earned perhaps $400. Cotton built the Garden District mansions one bale at a time. The second was sugar. Along the river above and below the city, from the German coast to the lower delta, stretched a continuous line of sugar plantations. By the 1850s, they produced roughly 250 million pounds of refined sugar a year. The largest sugar fortunes belonged to the Roman family, the Aimé family, the Bringuier family, and most spectacularly to a Northern Irish immigrant named John Burnside, known up and down the river as the Sugar Prince. Burnside owned 5 plantations totaling more than 7,000 acres and was reported, at the time of the Civil War, to be the wealthiest man in Louisiana. His Huma's house on the river was the kind of place where a single dinner party could consume $3,000 in food and wine. The sugar lords of the river were the new Versailles, except their gardens were tended by enslaved hands, and their wealth was measured in barrels of brown crystals shipped downriver to be refined in New Orleans warehouses owned by their cousins. The third was the slave trade itself. New Orleans was, by every honest measure, the largest market for the buying and selling of human beings in the United States. The international slave trade had been banned by Congress in 1808, but the domestic trade was perfectly legal. Between 1820 and 1860, more than 400,000 enslaved men, women, and children passed through the slave pens of the city to be auctioned to planters from across the lower South. The two great slave-dealing firms operated entire city blocks. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, partners across 2 states, owned a pen on Esplanade Avenue and another on Common Street. Their company, Franklin and Armfield, sent the brig Tribune and the schooner Isaac Franklin between Alexandria, Virginia, and New Orleans every month carrying chained human cargo. Prices for a healthy adult man rose from around $800 in the 1830s to as much as $1,800 in 1860. A trader could buy an enslaved person in Maryland or Virginia for half what he could sell them for in Louisiana, march them south on foot in chained columns called coffles, and clear $200 to $300 of profit on every human being delivered. Franklin alone retired in the 1840s with a fortune that, by his own accounting, exceeded $10 million. By modern measures, he was among the richest men in the country. These 3 commodities did not run on parallel tracks. They ran on the same tracks. Every cotton plantation in the interior depended on enslaved labor bought in New Orleans. Every sugar plantation along the river depended on enslaved labor bought in New Orleans. The banks that financed the cotton and sugar trades took enslaved people as collateral. The insurance companies that insured the steamboats also insured the lives of enslaved workers. The credit lines that flowed from New York into the cotton economy passed through Louisiana banks whose ledgers showed human beings on the asset side. To buy cotton in New Orleans in 1860 was, by necessity and design, to buy from a system that had bought and sold the people who grew it. The grand hotels of the French Quarter, The Greek Revival mansions of the Garden District, the gas-lit opera houses, the oyster bars on Royal Street, every visible piece of the city's wealth was the surface above this single underlying economy. The chandeliers above and the chains below were lit by the same money. By the late 1850s, the city had more banks than any American city except New York. The Bank of Louisiana, the Citizens Bank, the Bank of New Orleans. Between them, they held deposits over $40 million. Insurance offices on Canal Street wrote policies on every bale of cotton and every steamboat that left the harbor. Shipyards along the Mississippi launched a new steamboat roughly every 10 days. The city was, for one brief decade in the middle of the 19th century, the financial capital of the South, and arguably the third great commercial city of the United States. Then the war came, and everything that had been built on those three commodities and those three pens and those three account books would be revealed for what it had always been. Chapter 3. The Last Beautiful Year. For one decade in the middle of the 19th century, New Orleans was the most cosmopolitan place in the country, and almost everything we still come to see was built then. Walk Royal Street today, and the iron balconies you photograph were forged in the 1840s and 1850s. The St. Louis Hotel Rotunda, before it was demolished in 1916, rose 4 stories above the heart of the quarter, under a painted dome that could hold 13 tons of plaster and weighed nothing on the eye. The Pontalba buildings, the long, elegant rows of red brick that frame Jackson Square, were completed in 1851 at a cost of $300,000 by the Baroness Michaela Almonester de Pontalba, a woman who, in 1834, had been shot 4 times by her own father-in-law in a property dispute in a Paris drawing room, survived, and then returned to New Orleans to make herself one of the great real estate developers of the 19th century. The Buckner Mansion on Jackson Avenue in the Garden District was completed in 1856 for the cotton factor Henry Sullivan Buckner at a cost of $175,000. It still stands, still ringed by its 48 white columns, still one of the largest single-family residences in the country. Every Greek pediment, every cast-iron balcony, every chandelier in those rooms was paid for by what was happening 4 blocks east on Esplanade Avenue at Franklin and Armfield's slave pen. The city did not see this as contradiction. The city saw it as architecture. Mardi Gras, as we now understand it, was invented in this decade. The mystic crew of Comus held its first secret society parade in 1857, parading through the streets at night, with flambeaux lighting their tableau. The Twelfth Night Revelers followed in 1870. The Crew of Rex was founded in 1872 for the visit of the Russian Grand Duke Alexis, who, the city joked, came south chasing an actress named Lydia Thompson. A single Comus ball in the late 1870s could cost the crew $50,000 in tableau, costumes, and supper for one night. The city's tradition of throwing itself a coronation in February, draped in costumes and gold beads, was already in place by the time the Civil War began. The world the city built in this decade was not just rich, it was loud about being rich. There were 3 opera houses operating simultaneously by 1860. The French Opera House on Bourbon Street opened in 1859 and torn from the city by fire in 1919, was considered acoustically the finest opera house in the country. The St. Charles Theatre and the Orleans Theatre offered separate seasons in French and English. Together, they staged more than 200 performances a year. The opera was not a luxury. It was a requirement of belonging. A wealthy Creole family kept a box subscription for $2,000 a year. They dressed for the season the way another city's elite would dress for war. The opera house was where alliances were sealed, where heiresses were displayed, where a glance from a particular box at a particular soprano could send a young man into financial ruin within 2 seasons. The Opera House was also where, on certain evenings, the after-performance carriage line stretched 4 blocks along Bourbon Street and turned, like clockwork, toward the slave pens, where business carried on by lamplight at almost any hour. The St. Charles Hotel, completed in 1837 and rebuilt in 1853 after fire, was the city's secular cathedral. Its great central dome rose 185 feet above the street. Its dining room could seat 500 at a single seating. Its rotunda was the trading floor of half the cotton in the South. Statesmen, planters, riverboat captains, gamblers, foreign aristocrats, opera singers, journalists, all of them lived inside this single hotel for weeks or months at a time. The St. Charles offered a city in miniature. You could conduct the business of a sugar empire, eat a 6-course dinner, attend an auction, hire a slave, hire a chambermaid, court a widow, lose a fortune at the gaming tables on the ground floor, and never set foot outside the building. The hotel burned to the ground in 1851. It was rebuilt within 2 years at greater grandeur. It burned again in 1894. It would be rebuilt twice more in the decades that followed. The city's habit was to lose its grandest buildings to fire and to rebuild them larger each time, as if the burning were itself proof of how rich the city had become, that it could afford to burn its St. Charles Hotel and build it again. The gas streetlights of the French Quarter were already in place by the 1850s, and the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line, the oldest continuously running streetcar line in the world, had begun operation in 1835. By 1860, the city was full of light and motion. More than 3,500 steamboats arrived at the city's wharves in 1860 alone, queuing along the bend of the river for berths. The population was approaching 170,000. French, Spanish, English, German, Sicilian, and African voices crossed in the quarter markets every morning. The opera season ran from October to April. The Mardi Gras balls began at 12:01 in the morning on 12th night. The wealthy traveled to Paris every other summer. The wealthy bought their pianos from Vienna and their silver from London, and their wines from the Bordeaux chateau that their cotton money had also helped finance. This was the moment the city stood at the height of its own bet. Every ledger book in every counting house on Canal Street was full of profit. Every bale and barrel that moved came at a margin. The light through the gas chandeliers of the St. Louis Hotel Rotunda was the brightest the city would ever know. And then, on a winter day in January of 1861, the state of Louisiana voted to leave the United States. The city began stockpiling Confederate currency. And on April 12th, in a harbor in South Carolina, 4 years of war began. Chapter 2. Of the city's life was over before it had finished reading itself. Chapter 4. The auction beneath the chandelier. The same painted dome that crowned the most fashionable hotel in the city was also the ceiling of the country's largest slave market. In the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel, 6 days a week, between the hours of noon and 3, a man named Joseph Beard, or one of his 3 competitors, stood on a wooden platform with a chained line of human beings behind him and called for opening bids. The room was octagonal. The dome above was painted with figures of justice and commerce. The light came down through 8 high windows and lit the marble floor. Around the platform, in a half circle, stood the buyers, sugar planters from the river, cotton factors with commissions to fill, northern visitors curious enough to wander in to watch, tourists, the polite word for them, who had read about the rotunda in their European guidebooks and had crossed an ocean partly to see for themselves whether the stories were true. They were. Beneath the chandelier, the auctioneer described each person in turn. The trade had its language, polished smooth from decades of repetition. A man was a buck. A woman was a wench. A child was a yearling. A skilled laborer was likely. A field worker was prime. A trained domestic worker was a number 1. A young woman, well-dressed, light-skinned, sometimes presented in silk, fetched in a particular category the city's wealthiest men understood, without it being said aloud, the so-called fancy girl trade. Prices were called out in dollars. The bidding went up by $10 or $20 at a time. A healthy man in 1860 might sell for $1,500 or $1,800. A woman with children fetched less because the buyers, after the bidding ended, would frequently take the children separately and resell them in a different transaction. Mothers and children were not, as a rule, kept together. The system did not require it. The 2 great firms of the city were Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, partners between Virginia and New Orleans, and Theophilus Freeman, who took over much of the trade after Franklin retired. Franklin and Armfield ran a vertical operation that prefigured the industrial economy of the next century. They owned the ships that carried their human cargo south. They owned the pens that held them when they arrived. They owned the warehouses where the new arrivals were fed and cleaned and dressed for sale. They owned the auction stalls. They owned the slates on which the prices were chalked. Between 1828 and 1836, the partnership moved between 1,000 and 2,000 people a year from the Upper South into Louisiana. They retired among the wealthiest men in the country. Franklin built a Tennessee plantation called Fairview that still stands today, a Greek revival pile that paid for itself in human suffering. The pens themselves were brick warehouses with iron gates and barred windows. Inside, men slept on the floor in long rooms divided by sex. Women and children were kept in separate yards. The pens fed their captives twice a day on cornmeal mush and pork fat. They oiled the skin of those for sale to give them a healthier appearance. They drilled them in answering the questions a buyer would ask. They taught the children to sing on command. They taught the women to smile. The buyers wanted goods that looked profitable. The pens supplied them. The trade was advertised in the city papers, the Picayune, the Delta, the Times. Notices ran daily. For sale, 100 prime field hands, just from Virginia, in the yard of Joseph Beard, near the cathedral. For sale, a likely seamstress, 20 years of age, light complexion, recommended by her former mistress. The advertisements ran beside notices for theater performances, for opera engagements, for steamboat departures. They ran beside ribbon shop announcements, beside ads for new shipments of French wine, beside lists of social calls received. The city did not segregate the language of the slave trade from the language of polite life. The two were the same language. This is the part of the story the modern city has the most difficulty telling. The St. Louis Hotel is gone now, demolished in 1916 after standing abandoned for 2 decades. The slave pens on Esplanade Avenue are buried beneath later structures and a parking lot. Until 2018, there was no marker at the site of the largest slave market in the United States. A small bronze plaque was finally placed at the corner of Esplanade and Chartres in that year, more than 150 years after the last auction. The plaque is easy to walk past. Most tourists do. Chapter 5. The Houses Behind the Houses. Behind every Royal Street townhouse stood a second building no tourist ever photographed, where the actual city was made. The technical name for these buildings was the Dependency. The actual name everyone in the city used was the servant quarters, or, more often, simply the back building. They stood at the rear of the property, 2 and 3 stories tall, with an iron staircase climbing the back wall, separated from the main house by a courtyard paved in brick. In the courtyard, a banana tree grew. A cistern collected rainwater off the slate roofs. A pump stood in the corner. Smoke rose from the brick chimney of the kitchen all day. This was where the household actually existed. A wealthy townhouse on Royal Street or Chartres Street in 1860 would contain between 8 and 20 enslaved domestic workers, plus the children of those workers. The household functioned as a self-contained economy of labor. The cook ran the kitchen with 2 or 3 assistants. The cook was usually one of the older women in the household and held considerable internal authority because she controlled what was eaten and how it was prepared, and the family in the front house relied on her absolutely. The laundress, often a younger woman, washed and ironed in a separate small building in the courtyard. The laundry kitchen had its own brick boiler that ran from dawn to dusk. Sheets and linens for a household of 15 people, with multiple changes a day in summer, required cauldrons of hot water, and the lifting of those cauldrons by women who became, over time, physically broken by the work. The laundress was the lowest status position in the enslaved domestic hierarchy. She lived shortest. She earned the least notice. Then there were the maids, the seamstresses, the carriage drivers, the gardeners, the gatekeepers, the wet nurses for the family's babies, the personal servants for each member of the front house family, the boys who polished the silver, and the boys who carried water. Each had a role. Each lived in the back building and rose before dawn and worked until the front house slept. They were fed in the kitchen after the front house had been served. They slept on pallets in the back rooms. The household had to feed and clothe each of them, at an annual cost of roughly $40 per person, which the family treated as a kind of utility expense. The actual worker, in the moral arithmetic of the family, did not earn this. The owner was being generous by providing it. After emancipation in 1865, the system did not collapse. It transformed. The back buildings remained, the work remained. The hands that did the work changed. Newly freed women returned to the same kitchens. Newly arrived Irish and German immigrants moved into the upper floors of the back buildings. A free domestic worker in the 1870s earned between $3 and $7 a month plus room and board. That was not a transformation of conditions. It was the same labor for a small wage. The Royal Street townhouses kept running the way they had always run. The light shone out the front windows. The carriages waited by the gate. The opera was still attended in season. Nothing about the front house changed visibly. Only the names in the back building changed, and the small entries in the household accounts where the wages were now noted. Walk the French Quarter today, and you can still see this architecture if you know what to look for. Every entrance with a wide carriage doorway opens to a passage. The passage leads to a courtyard. The courtyard opens to a back building 2 or 3 stories high with an iron staircase. The back buildings have been converted now into apartments, into Airbnb rentals, into restaurants. The brick stoves where the cook stood are buried under floor tiles. The cisterns are gone. But the buildings themselves are still there, still standing, still defining the actual depth of every block. The grand townhouse is the front of the building. The back building is the rest of it. To understand the quarter, you have to understand that the quarter is roughly twice as deep as it looks from the street, and the additional depth is the people the city pretended it did not see. The same was true on every street in the wealthy parts of the city. The Garden District mansions had separate servant wings and separate carriage houses with rooms above. The St. Charles Hotel had 4 floors of staff quarters above the public rooms, holding perhaps 200 employees on any given night. The Opera House had dressing rooms, kitchens, dressers, hairdressers, gas lighters, fire watchers, doormen. None of this was visible to the gentleman in evening dress arriving for his seat. The city had perfected the art of invisible labor. It had built the architecture to make invisibility possible, and once the architecture existed, the moral arithmetic of using it became permanent, because to use a building is, in the end, to use the people who run it. The defenders of the city's antebellum culture sometimes argued, and still argue, that domestic slavery in New Orleans was milder than plantation slavery. They were not wrong about the physical work being less brutal in the houses than in the cane fields. They were wrong about everything else. The domestic worker lived inside the family's life. She raised the family's children. She knew the names of every uncle and cousin. She listened to every quarrel through the courtyard. She was not a stranger to the family in the front house, and that proximity, that constant intimacy with people who treated her, in the end, as a piece of property, was a kind of cruelty plantation slavery did not match. It was the cruelty of being close. It was the cruelty of being unseen by people who knew your face very well. Chapter 6. The Mosquito and the Pump. Every August, the wealthy fled the city, and every August, the poor stayed and counted the funerals. The disease that drove them out had names in different decades: yellow fever, bronze John, the saffron scourge, the black vomit. It returned to New Orleans almost every summer between 1796 and 1905. It killed at least 40,000 people in the city across that period, and probably many more, because the city stopped keeping accurate records during the worst years, and the bodies were buried in mass graves in the cemeteries north of the French Quarter without much accounting. The epidemics had a pattern. They began in late June or early July, when the rain stopped and the standing water in the city's drainage canals warmed to the temperature mosquitoes required. They peaked in August and September. They ended in November, when the first cool nights of the year killed the mosquitoes. Then the city counted its dead, washed its streets with vinegar and slaked lime, and went on. The pattern repeated. The disease did not slow. It killed perhaps 4,000 people in the city in 1853. It killed perhaps another 4,000 in 1878. In an epidemic that spread throughout the Mississippi Valley and killed more than 20,000 people across multiple states. By the 1870s, the city's reputation among northern travelers had become so toxic that the volume of summer commerce dropped year after year. New Orleans was understood to be a city where, in August, you could die for reasons unrelated to anything you had done. Nobody knew, until the very end of the 19th century, that mosquitoes carried the disease. Theories ran wild. The disease was thought to be a curse of the swamps, the punishment of bad air, the result of the city's moral failings, the consequence of certain foreign cargoes. Streets were lit with sulfur fires in August in the hope that the smoke would drive away whatever invisible force was killing people. Cannons were fired over the city, the theory being that the concussion would shake the bad air out of the streets. Tar barrels burned at intersections. None of it worked because none of the theories were correct. The disease was carried by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a small insect that bred in the standing water of the city's open drainage ditches. That fact was finally established by Walter Reed and his team of military doctors in Cuba in 1900 and was confirmed in New Orleans during the city's last great epidemic in 1905. Once the cause was understood, the city's response was finally rational: drain the standing water, fumigate the ditches, pump the swamps. New Orleans began the work that should have begun a century earlier. The engineer who took the lead was a man named Albert Baldwin Wood, a New Orleans native born in 1879, who became chief engineer of the Sewerage and Water Board at the age of 29. Wood invented a device he called the wood screw pump. It was a horizontal screw nearly 12 feet in diameter, set in a concrete channel, driven by a 100-horsepower electric motor. A single wood screw pump could move 10,000 cubic feet of water a minute. By 1915, the city had 12 such pumping stations operating, capable of moving 13 billion gallons of water in 24 hours. The wood screw pump was the largest urban drainage pump in the world. Other cities, in other countries, sent engineers to study it. Wood himself became an international celebrity in the small world of municipal water engineering. The pumps allowed New Orleans to drain its low-lying back-of-town neighborhoods, the marshes between the city and Lake Pontchartrain. The streets of Gentilly, Lakeview, the 7th Ward, and the further reaches of the 9th Ward were laid out on land the pumps had only just made dry enough to walk on, much less to build on. This was the bet within the bet. The original bet, made by Bienville in 1718, had been that the river could be ignored long enough to extract its commerce. The new bet, made by Wood and his engineers in the early 20th century, was that the lake and the swamp could be ignored long enough to extend the city. Both bets ran on borrowed time. Both required pumps and engines and human attention that never stopped. The day the pumps failed, the bet was over. By the 1930s, the city had stretched far into ground that lay several feet below sea level. The lower 9th Ward, the Lakeview neighborhood, much of Gentilly, all of these areas were neighborhoods that, without the pumps and the levees and the canals, would simply have been water. The middle-class houses that filled them, the small bungalows and shotgun homes and brick ranches that became home to thousands of working families, sat on slabs poured over ground that had been swamp 2 decades earlier. The houses were dry, the bet was holding. The cemeteries, meanwhile, told the other half of the story. They were laid out above ground because the ground itself could not hold bodies. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, opened in 1789, became known as a city of the dead, with white plastered mausoleums arranged in narrow streets, each tomb a small house, each tomb reused generation after generation. The city's relationship with water was that even its dead could not lie down in the earth. Even its dead had to be lifted above it, walled in, sealed away from a river that was always trying to come back. For nearly a century the pumps held. For nearly a century the cemeteries held. For nearly a century the bet within the bet kept paying. Then on a single August morning in 2005, the bet would be called all at once. Chapter 7. The Day the Beast Arrived. In the spring of 1862, the Union fleet sailed past the downriver forts, and the richest city in the South surrendered without firing a shot. The man in command of the Union ships was Rear Admiral David Glasgow Farragut, born 61 years earlier in Tennessee, a sailor since the age of 9, a Southerner who had stayed with the Union when his birth state did not. His fleet of 17 ships, including 4 old wooden steam frigates and 13 gunboats, ran the gauntlet of Forts Jackson and St. Philip on the lower Mississippi during the early morning hours of April 24, 1862. The forts had been confidently built. The chain across the river had been confidently set. The Confederate ironclads upstream had been confidently launched. Within 3 hours of the engagement beginning, the chain was broken. 2 of the ironclads were on fire, and Farragut's fleet was past the forts. By the morning of April 25th, the United States Navy was anchored off the levee at the foot of Canal Street, every gun pointed at the city. The mayor of New Orleans, John Monroe, sent a written protest. There was no Confederate army between the fleet and the city. The river had delivered the city to the Union in a single morning. Farragut demanded the city's surrender. Monroe surrendered it. On April 29, 1862, the United States flag was raised over the Custom House on Canal Street. New Orleans was the first major Confederate city to fall to Union forces. It would remain under federal military occupation for the rest of the Civil War and most of the Reconstruction period that followed. The man who took charge of the city as military governor was Major General Benjamin Butler, a Massachusetts lawyer turned political general who arrived in May of 1862 and within weeks made himself the most hated man in the city's history. Butler's policies were practical. He hung a Confederate sympathizer named William Mumford for tearing down the United States flag from the Mint. He confiscated the property of citizens who refused to swear loyalty oaths. He shut down newspapers that criticized the occupation. He imposed sanitary measures that, for the first time in the city's history, actually reduced the yellow fever outbreak the next summer. He fed the poor of the city, regardless of race, from Union Army stores. He was, by some measures, a competent administrator. The city loathed him anyway. Two acts in particular ensured his place in the city's memory. The first was General Order No. 28, issued in May of 1862, which stated that any woman of New Orleans who insulted a Union soldier should be treated, by that very act, as a prostitute plying her trade in the streets. The order was meant to address the daily harassment of his soldiers by upper-class women who spat in their faces and emptied chamber pots from their balconies. The order was effective. It was also so offensive to the codes of 19th century chivalry that it was condemned by name in the British Parliament, leading the British Prime Minister to make a speech in the House of Commons about the conduct of the American war. The second was a persistent accusation, never proven and probably exaggerated but believed throughout the South for the rest of the war, that Butler had personally pocketed silverware from the houses he confiscated. From this came his second nickname, Spoons Butler, which he carried with as much pride as the first. The economic damage during the war years was catastrophic, far worse than the political humiliation. The cotton trade collapsed entirely. The cotton that did manage to reach New Orleans was confiscated by the Union Army, sold north, and the proceeds went to the federal treasury. The slave trade ended permanently in 1865. 400,000 human beings released from a system that had built the city's grandeur in just over 40 years. The Confederate currency held by every bank in the city, every household, every counting house, was instantly worthless when the war ended. Thousands of merchants who had been wealthy in 1860 stood in 1865 without enough cash to pay their household servants for the week. The plantations along the river ceased to produce. The labor system on which the entire economy of Louisiana had depended for 140 years was destroyed. There was, in effect, nothing left of the antebellum economy by the time the war ended. Reconstruction was a long, violent, contested period. The federal government attempted to remake the city's politics, brought formerly enslaved black men into office for the first time, built schools, opened the courts, registered voters. White citizens fought back with terror. The Battle of Liberty Place in September of 1874 was a kind of small civil war in the streets, with several thousand members of the White League attacking the integrated city police force and the Louisiana State Militia. 27 people died in the streets of the French Quarter in a single afternoon. The federal government sent troops. Order was restored. 3 years later, in the political bargain that ended the contested presidential election of 1876, the federal troops were withdrawn from Louisiana. Reconstruction was over. The reform governments of Louisiana, with their black office holders and integrated schools, were dismantled within a year. New Orleans entered the era of Jim Crow in a kind of practical defeat from which it would not really recover for 100 years. By 1880, the city looked like a place trying to remember what it had been. The St. Charles Hotel still stood, the opera still ran, the Mardi Gras parades still rolled, but the cotton was leaving by rail to ports the river could no longer compete with. The river itself was being supplanted, and the slow second collapse, the one that would last a century, had already begun. Chapter 8. The Slow Choking of a Kingdom. The river was being replaced by something New Orleans could not see or compete with. And by the time the city noticed, the choice had already been made for it. That something was the railroad. In the years after the Civil War, the iron lines that had been laid across the South and the Midwest connected every cotton-growing region and every grain-producing state directly to the East Coast ports of Charleston, Savannah, Norfolk, and Baltimore. A planter in Mississippi or Tennessee or Arkansas no longer had to ship his cotton south on a boat to be repacked in New Orleans and resold by a New Orleans cotton factor. He could put it on a train, and the train would carry it east in days. The factors in New Orleans, whose entire trade had depended on being the gatekeepers of the river economy, watched their margins shrink and then watched their commissions disappear. By 1880, New Orleans was no longer the largest cotton port in the world. By 1900, Houston had passed New Orleans in shipping tonnage. By the 1930s, Houston had passed New Orleans in population. By the 1960s, Houston was several times the size and economic weight of the city it had once trailed. The river had given New Orleans its empire, and the iron horse took it away. The bend in the Mississippi that had been the most valuable real estate in the South in 1860 was, in 1900, just a bend in a river. The city's political response was a long descent into machine corruption. The Louisiana Lottery Company, chartered by the state legislature in 1868, ran a national lottery from offices in New Orleans for 25 years. The company controlled $300,000 in annual political contributions to keep its charter renewed and to prevent investigations. Reformers in the press began calling it the octopus. The octopus bought legislators, governors, sheriffs, and editors. Its lottery tickets were sold in every state of the Union by mail. Federal action finally killed it in 1890 when Congress banned the use of the United States mail for lottery purposes. By that point, the octopus had taught the city's politics a thoroughly bad lesson. The lesson was that political office was a kind of inheritance, that contracts were a kind of currency, and that elections were a kind of formality to be managed. The city's politics never quite recovered from the lottery years. What followed was a succession of political bosses who controlled the city's machinery for decades each. John Fitzpatrick, the Choctaw Club boss in the 1890s. Martin Berman, who served as mayor for 16 years, between 1904 and 1925. The Old Regulars, the Choctaws, the Stable Boys, names that meant something to those who knew the inside of the city's wards and meant nothing to anyone else. The bosses ran patronage networks that placed thousands of city employees, gave out contracts, and turned out the vote on election day. The city's police, courts, and inspectors operated throughout most of this period as extensions of the boss's machine. Reform efforts came and went, sometimes succeeding briefly. The machine reformed itself faster than its enemies could. Above the city machine sat the Long machine, founded by Huey Long in the 1920s and continued by his brother Earl Long into the 1960s. Huey Long, born in Poor Wynn Parish in 1893, became governor of Louisiana at the age of 35 and remade the state by the simple method of taking on its oligarchs and beating them. He built roads, schools, hospitals, and bridges. He provided free textbooks to every child in the state. He also bought, intimidated, or dismissed every office holder who opposed him, packed the legislature with allies, controlled the state police, and dispensed favors through a personal organization that ran outside the formal government. He was assassinated in the marble corridor of the new state capitol in Baton Rouge in September of 1935 at the age of 42, shot by the son-in-law of a judge he had been trying to remove from office. His brother Earl took over the family business. Earl Long served 3 separate terms as governor, was committed briefly to a mental hospital while still in office, conducted a public affair with a Bourbon Street stripper named Blaze Starr, and was, by the standards of Louisiana politics, an honest man. The contradiction sums up the state's politics for a century. Yellow fever returned for one last great visit in 1905. The epidemic was the smallest of the century in death count, but the most influential in policy because it was the one during which the mosquito theory was finally accepted and the city's drainage system was finally built. The disease never returned. The pumps held. The city stretched into the lakeside neighborhoods. In 1917, under pressure from the United States Navy, the city closed Storyville, the legal red light district that had operated for 20 years just north of the quarter. Storyville was not a small thing. At its peak in the 1900s and the early 1910s, the 16-block district contained more than 2,000 registered prostitutes and roughly 175 brothels. The mansions of Lulu White, Josie Arlington, and Countess Willie Piazza occupied entire blocks. The music played in Storyville saloons by men whose names included Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, and a teenager named Louis Armstrong became known to the world as jazz. The closing of Storyville sent those musicians north on the river. Within a decade, the music had reached Chicago and New York and the world. The city limped through the 20th century. The Great Depression hit hard. World War II brought a brief boom in shipbuilding and military traffic. The post-war decades brought white flight to the suburbs, the gradual abandonment of the old wealthy neighborhoods, the construction of the interstate over the Trem neighborhood that destroyed a black middle-class district to build a freeway, the rise of the petroleum industry along the river, and the slow grinding poverty of the neighborhoods the pumps had only just made dry. By the 1990s, New Orleans had the highest murder rate of any large American city. Its school system was a national disgrace. Its housing stock was crumbling. Its tax base was hollowing out. Its population had fallen from a peak of 627,000 in 1960 to 484,000 in 2000. The tourists still came. They came for the food, the music, the quarter, the parades. They came for the parts of the city that the city had been built to show them. They did not come for the parts the city had always hidden. The hidden parts were sliding back into the water that had built them. Chapter 9. The morning the water came back. At 6:10 on a Monday morning in August, the storm the city had been pretending was not coming finally arrived. Hurricane Katrina had formed 8 days earlier as a small tropical depression over the Bahamas. It had crossed Florida as a weak hurricane, weakened in the Everglades, re-entered the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico on August 26th, and there had begun to grow at a speed forecasters had rarely seen. By Sunday, August 28th, Katrina was a Category 5 storm with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour, the third strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. It was aimed directly at the city of New Orleans. The mayor, Ray Nagin, issued the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order at 9:47 on Sunday morning, 24 hours before landfall. By Sunday evening, roughly 1 million people had left the metropolitan area. The contraflow on the interstate carried both lanes of traffic away from the city. The roads were jammed for 18 hours. Then, the roads emptied. By Sunday night, the city was largely deserted. Roughly 100,000 people, however, had not left. Some had no car. Some had no money for gasoline or for the motels they would need at the end of the drive. Some were elderly and could not face the journey. Some did not believe the storm would actually arrive. Some were sick or in hospitals or in prisons and could not be moved. Some did not want to leave their pets or their houses or the small life they had built. They stayed. The Superdome had been opened as a shelter of last resort. Roughly 25,000 people made their way there during Sunday afternoon and evening. They were searched, ticketed, and sent inside. The arena's air conditioning was working. The roof was intact. There were sandwiches and bottled water in the corridors. The Louisiana National Guard was inside with weapons. The people inside the Superdome would discover, over the next 5 days, that this was not nearly enough. Katrina made landfall at 6:10 on Monday morning at Buras Triumph in Plaquemines Parish, south of New Orleans. By the time it reached the city, it had weakened to a strong Category 3 storm with winds of 125 miles per hour. The wind damage to the city itself was significant but survivable. Roofs came off. Trees fell, windows broke. The roof of the Superdome itself was partially torn. 2 large sections peeled back, exposing the interior to the sky. People inside watched the daylight come through holes that had not been there an hour earlier. But the wind, as the forecasters had said, was not what was going to kill the city. What was going to kill the city was the levees. Sometime between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock that Monday morning, the levee system began to fail. The 17th Street Canal flood wall, which separated the Lake Pontchartrain side of the city from the Lakeview neighborhood, collapsed in a section roughly 450 feet long. The London Avenue Canal floodwall failed in 2 places. The Industrial Canal, which separated the lower Ninth Ward from the rest of the city, failed in 2 places on its east side. By the most thorough later accounting, performed by independent engineers retained by the state of Louisiana, the system failed in 53 separate places. The water came in from multiple sides at once. In the lower Ninth Ward, the failure was catastrophic. A loose barge from the Industrial Canal smashed through the failing floodwall and was pushed by the rising water into the neighborhood, where it knocked houses off their foundations and slammed them into the ones behind. Witnesses spoke of a roar like a freight train. Within 15 minutes, the neighborhood was under several feet of water. Within an hour, entire blocks were submerged to the rooflines. In Levees, the water came from the lakeside, filling the streets so quickly that a person sleeping in a 1-story house in the early hours of Monday morning could wake to find water rising into the bed beneath them. In Gentilly, the water came in from 2 directions. In New Orleans East, an area of more than 50,000 residents, the water came in from the lake and from the canals and from the surrounding wetlands all at once. By Tuesday morning, August 30th, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. In some places, the water was 6 feet deep. In some places, it was 15 feet deep. The pumps that Albert Baldwin Wood had designed a century earlier were either underwater themselves or unable to pump fast enough against the inflow. The water sat. It sat for weeks. In some neighborhoods, it sat for more than a month. Approximately 1,464 people died in Louisiana in the storm and the flood, the great majority of them in New Orleans itself. The youngest victim was a 4-month-old infant who drowned in a flooded house in the lower Ninth Ward. The oldest was a 107-year-old woman who died on a hospital bed during evacuation. About half of the dead were people over the age of 74. The water sought out the slowest, the smallest, the poorest. It always does. The black neighborhoods of New Orleans, which had been built on the lowest ground because that was the ground available to them in the segregated city of a previous century, were the ones the water visited first and stayed in longest. The wealthy neighborhoods of the French Quarter, Uptown, and the Garden District, built on the high natural levee, were untouched. What the country watched on television over the next week is the part of the story that does not require retelling. The Superdome, with its torn roof and 25,000 people sheltering inside without air conditioning, without working sanitation, without sufficient water or food. The Montreal Convention Center, with another 15,000. The bridges out of the city that the desperate tried to cross only to be turned back by armed police from the suburbs across the river. The bodies floating in the streets, attended by no one for days, photographed by helicopter from above. The slow, inadequate arrival of the federal response. The press conferences in Washington that seemed to address some other crisis in some other country. The director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency commenting that his organization was doing a heck of a job. The president flying over the city in Air Force One, looking down through the window. All of it unfolded in real time on every television in the country. The country did not look away. Many people in the country said afterwards that they had not realized, until that week, how much they had not been looking. When the water finally went down, the city that emerged was not the city that had gone in. Chapter 10. The Roof That Was Never Coming Off. The largest dome in the world was supposed to be the city's proudest building, and instead it became the picture the country could not look away from. The Louisiana Superdome had opened in 1975 at a cost of $134 million. It was the largest fixed dome roof in the world at the time. Its diameter was 680 feet. Its roof spanned 9.5 acres. It had been built as the symbol of a new New Orleans, a modern city that could no longer rely on the decaying glamour of the antebellum past, but had to find a new identity in the late 20th century. The Superdome housed the Saints football team, the Sugar Bowl, the Republican National Convention of 1988, the Pope's visit in 1987, every great event the city wanted to put on. It was the second largest building project in the city's history, behind only the levee system itself. The Superdome was the levee system's neighbor, in a sense. They were both the city's 2 great answers to 2 great problems, and they failed at almost the same moment. When Katrina arrived, the Superdome was supposed to be the safe place. The mayor had directed the city's poorest residents there. The Louisiana National Guard had set up inside. The structural engineers had certified the building could withstand winds of 200 miles per hour. They were correct about the structure. They were wrong about everything else. The first sign that things would not hold was the roof. At about 7 on Monday morning, two large sections of the roof's outer covering, the white Teflon-coated fiberglass that gave the dome its distinctive appearance, were peeled back by the winds. Inside, people heard the sound of metal tearing. Then daylight appeared in the ceiling. Then rainwater began coming through the openings. The interior of the dome began to take on water from above, as the city outside began to take on water from below. By Monday evening, the air conditioning had failed. The Superdome had been designed to be cooled. It had not been designed to hold 25,000 people in late August with no cooling. Inside, the temperature rose toward 90 degrees and stayed there. The toilets backed up. The plumbing failed. There were not enough portable toilets. The corridors became impossible. People slept on the concrete walkways with no blankets, no pillows, no privacy. The food, which had been calculated for a 2-day shelter event, ran short within the first day. The water bottles ran short. The medical supplies ran out by Tuesday. 2 people died inside the building. A man jumped from an upper concourse to his death on the lower deck. An elderly man died, apparently of a heart attack, in his folding chair. Their bodies lay in the corridors for days because there was no one to take them out. The smell by the 3rd day was something that those who were inside have described in similar terms in every account that has been written. It was the smell of human bodies, sweat, urine, feces, garbage, blood, and fear, in a sealed building in summer in Louisiana with no ventilation. The country saw the building from the outside. The country saw the people who were finally bussed out, days late, dehydrated, exhausted, carrying what they had carried in. The country saw the comparison between what was happening inside this American convention center and the kinds of news pictures the country was used to seeing from other parts of the world. The country did not have a vocabulary in 2005 for what it was looking at. The country had thought, perhaps without realizing it, that the kinds of things happening in the Superdome were not the kinds of things that happened in the United States. The reckoning, when it came, was slow. The director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency resigned within 2 weeks. The administrator above him was reassigned. The city's mayor was re-elected the following spring, partly on the strength of an emotional radio interview he had given during the disaster begging for help. The governor of Louisiana did not run again. The president's approval rating, which had been at 51% before the storm, fell to 40% within a month and never fully recovered. The political shock would echo through the rest of his administration. The lessons that emerged from the Superdome were studied in disaster management seminars for years afterward. The next major hurricane evacuation, 3 years later for Hurricane Gustav, would be carried out far more smoothly. The Superdome would never again be used as a shelter of last resort. It became instead the symbol of why a city should not need a shelter of last resort, why the levees should not be allowed to fail, why the evacuation must reach everyone. The building was rebuilt at a cost of $336 million. The roof was replaced. The interior was gutted and refitted. The Saints came back in 2006 and won the Super Bowl 4 years after that. A citywide redemption that lifted everyone for a season. The building was renamed several times for corporate sponsors. It is now the Caesars Superdome. The pictures from August of 2005, however, did not get rebuilt. They will be the building's other meaning for as long as anyone alive remembers what it was like to watch them happen. Chapter 11. The Streets That Stayed Empty. 20 years after the water, walk through the lower 9th Ward and you can hear what is missing more clearly than what is still there. The neighborhood that once held more than 14,000 residents on tightly packed blocks of shotgun houses and small bungalows now holds fewer than 2,000. The streets are still there. The asphalt is still there. The street signs are mostly still there. What is missing is the houses. Where there used to be a row of 9 homes on a block, there are now perhaps 2 homes and 7 empty lots covered in tall grass. The grass grows shoulder high in the summer. The lots are mowed by the city when the city remembers to mow them. Hawks circle above them, looking for the mice that have moved into the spaces where families used to live. The lower 9th Ward was, before Katrina, one of the highest rates of black home ownership in any urban neighborhood in the country. More than 59% of the families in the neighborhood own their homes. This was not a stereotype of urban poverty. This was a working-class, family-centered, church-going neighborhood, built up over 3 generations of post-war migration into a city that had offered black families the chance to buy property when other northern and southern cities had largely shut them out. The houses had been bought slowly, paid down slowly, kept slowly. They had been passed from one generation to the next, sometimes without proper paperwork, often with informal arrangements between cousins and aunts. When the water came in, the houses came off their foundations. The houses moved. The houses ended up on top of other houses. The properties became, in many cases, impossible to reclaim because the heirship was unclear, the insurance was inadequate, the bureaucracy of the Road Home program was punishing, and the families themselves had been scattered to Houston and Atlanta and Memphis and could not return easily enough to fight for the lots they had inherited. The Make It Right Foundation, founded by the actor Brad Pitt in 2006, undertook to rebuild the Lower Ninth one house at a time. The foundation engaged 21 architects to design homes that would be affordable, energy efficient, hurricane resistant, and beautiful. Between 2008 and 2015, the foundation built 109 homes on lots that families had reclaimed. The houses were striking. They had bright colors, unusual angles, solar panels, raised foundations. The neighborhood, for a brief moment in the early 2010s, looked like the architectural future. Then the houses began to fail. The materials chosen for the experimental designs, in many cases, did not work in the New Orleans climate. Wood rotted, treatments failed, mold grew. Within a decade, dozens of the Make It Right homes were uninhabitable or had been condemned. A class action lawsuit was filed by homeowners against the foundation in 2018, alleging defective construction. The foundation, which had publicly raised more than $26 million for the project, settled portions of the suit and effectively dissolved. The Lower Ninth is the most visible example of what happened across many of the flooded neighborhoods. Lakeview, which had been a middle-class white neighborhood on the lakeside of the city, has largely come back because the families who lived there had more insurance, more savings, more institutional support, and homes built on slightly higher ground. Gentilly has come back in patches, with new homes mixed among the empty lots. New Orleans East, the vast neighborhood that had been built in the 1960s as a planned middle-class community for black professionals, has come back slowly and partially. Pontchartrain Park, a black middle-class neighborhood designed in the 1950s around a golf course, has come back. The pattern across the city is uneven. The wealthiest neighborhoods, which were on the high ground, never flooded. The middle-class neighborhoods, which had the resources to rebuild, came back. The poorest neighborhoods, which had the fewest resources, came back the least. The population of New Orleans was 484,000 in the 2000 census, the last one before the storm. It fell to about 210,000 in the months immediately after the storm. It rose to 344,000 by 2010. The most recent census put it at 370,000. This is the lowest population for New Orleans since the 1870s. The city has effectively lost a century and a half of growth in 20 years. There is no path back to the population of 2000. The empty lots are not, in any realistic projection, going to refill. The blocks the water emptied are going to stay emptied. The city the visitor walks through is smaller than it was, smaller than it has been for as long as anyone alive can remember. What the storm took, the storm took. What it did not take, it changed. Festali, Chapter 12. What the Mississippi always wanted. The river that built this city was always going to ask for it back, and the only question was when and whether anything would be left when it did. 300 years after Bienville planted his flag in the mud, the river is still there. It still drains 41% of the continental United States past the bend that he chose. It still carries down to the Gulf, every minute of every day, more than 500,000 cubic feet of sediment per second when the Mississippi is in flood. The river still tries, every spring, to break its banks and flood the city that was built in its path. The city still pumps the water away, with the same kind of engines Albert Baldwin Wood designed a century ago, only larger now, and supplemented by the great new flood walls and surge barriers the United States Army Corps of Engineers built after Katrina, a hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system that has cost the federal government $14.5 billion and counting. The system, by every measurement so far, is better than what was there in 2005. The new flood walls are deeper, more strongly anchored, more carefully engineered. The new surge barriers across the eastern approaches to the city, the Lake-Borgne Surge Barrier, 2 miles long, 26 feet high, is one of the largest civil works projects ever built in the United States. New Orleans, by the official standards of the Army Corps, is now protected against a 100-year flood. The Corps will tell you that, with confidence. The next storm to test the system has not yet arrived. The city itself sits on average between 1 and 3 feet lower than it did when Katrina hit. The subsidence of the delta, the slow sinking of the ground itself, as the river is no longer allowed to deposit fresh sediment over the city, is accelerating. The sea, meanwhile, is rising. The Mississippi River Delta is losing 1 football field of land to the Gulf of Mexico every 100 minutes, according to the most recent estimates of the United States Geological Survey. The wetlands that once buffered the city against storm surge are disappearing into open water. The protective barrier between New Orleans and the open Gulf is thinner every year. The arithmetic, viewed from a distance and on a long time scale, is not encouraging. The city the visitor walks through has, by the most careful long-term projections, perhaps a century left in its current form. Perhaps more if the engineering continues to improve. Perhaps less if a storm of the size now considered possible arrives in the wrong season. What was bought and sold to build this city is gone. The slave pens were demolished long ago. The St. Louis Hotel was demolished in 1916. The French Opera House burned in 1919. Storyville was demolished in the 1940s. The Iberville housing project that replaced it was demolished in 2013. The streetcar lines that crossed every neighborhood in the 1920s have been reduced to 4. The pre-war population of nearly 630,000 is gone and will not return. The empty lots of the lower ninth will stay empty. The neighborhoods of the dead are larger than the neighborhoods of the living in measurable acres, in some parts of the city now. The cemeteries the city built above ground are still there. The cemeteries are full. The dead are still above the water, walled in their family tombs, sealed away from a river that has been trying to take them, like everything else, since the day Bienville chose this ground. What survives is the surface. The French Quarter, on its natural levee, is still there. The Cabildo, the Presbytère, the Cathedral, the Pontalba buildings, the old Ursuline convent, built between 1745 and 1752, is still the oldest building in the Mississippi River Valley. The St. Charles streetcar still runs. The Mardi Gras parades still roll every year, draped in the same colors and throwing the same beads. The opera, in new buildings, still has its season. The jazz musicians, descended from Storyville, still play in the bars and on the street corners. The tourists still come. They come for the beauty. They have always come for the beauty. The lesson the city teaches, if it teaches anything, is that the beauty was always a covering. The architecture was always financed by what was happening beneath it. The Grand Hotel was always above the slave market. The Opera Box was always above the Cotton Ledger. The Garden District Mansion was always paid for by the field labor and the courtyard labor and the laundry labor, by names the family knew well and chose not to speak about. The pumps that kept the city dry were always running on borrowed time. The levees that kept the river out were always one storm away from being asked the question. The bet that the city had been making since the day Bienville stepped onto the soft ground at the bend of the river was always going to be called, and one Monday morning in August, it was. The water came back. It found the lowest ground first, because it always does. It found the people who had been placed on the lowest ground because they had been given no other ground to live on. It killed roughly 1,500 of them. It washed away their houses. It emptied their streets. And when it finally went down, what was left behind was a city smaller, quieter, sadder, and at last, unable to pretend any longer. The audience comes for the iron balconies. The audience comes for the beignets and the brass bands and the second lines and the costumes and the carnival. The audience comes for the city's grin. The lesson, when the audience leaves, is that the grin was always a kind of mask, that the city had been smiling the way a man with a debt smiles at the door, hoping the collector will go away, that the river is the collector has been to the door before, that the collector is patient, and that the collector will come back. Bienville chose the ground anyway. He knew the river would not give it up easily. He knew the bet would be called one day. He chose the ground because the river left him no other answer. 3 centuries later, looking down at what was built and what was lost, what was bought and what was sold, what was hidden and what was finally seen, the question is not whether the bet was foolish. The question is whether the city, having made it, having paid for it, having built itself into something both grand and unforgivable on the strength of it, has anything left to bet again. 300 years from Bienville's flag, the river is still there. The city is still there for now. The opera is still in season. The next storm has not yet arrived. The bet, somewhere out on the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico, is being prepared to be called again.